Hello and welcome once again to another edition of Beverly's Times Past. My name is Ed Josephs, and once again we have with us this evening our very good friend, Mr. Richard Symmes, who is the curator of the Walker collection of photographs down at the Beverly Historical Society and Museum. Dick, once again, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ted. Nice to be here.
And we're going to continue this evening with a little presentation on the history of transportation in this area. And we have previously, I think, recorded two very fine programs on the trolley system here in the greater Beverly area. And tonight we thought we'd chat a little bit about the bus transportation system as it developed around the turn of the century. And perhaps we could start by going into a little bit of the history, perhaps, of transportation and how this all evolved, perhaps beginning back at the colonial time.
Right. Well, as we covered on the initial program of this threesome, you had horseback. People had a horse. They'd get on the horse and ride somewhere, one person. Then you had stagecoaches, which of course went way back even before colonial days, even to the English and European history, and that lasted well into the 1800s. And you know, a stagecoach would carry 6, 8 people maybe, depending on whether or not they used the top of the stagecoach in good weather. And long trips were arduous, obviously. They stayed overnight at taverns and inns. And so really it was a tough way for anybody to make a long trip. The roads were rough, it was dusty, cold, there was no heat of any kind, and it was just a miserable way to get around.
Along with the stagecoach mode, they had what they call a jitney, which was somewhat similar to a stagecoach.
Yeah, you had wagons of varying sizes that would hold people, like a barge or an omnibus. Again, it was sort of like an extended wagon type thing with a body and windows. And again, you can imagine rough riding, dusty, wet, you know, with no glass, that sort of thing.
Kind of tough.
Tough going, yeah.
Well, then along came the invention of the steam engine, and that drastically changed our method of travel.
Right. The steam engine, of course, you had that develop in the 1830s, and once the railroading began to take off, say in the 1840s, up until the time of the Civil War, it really did change long-distance travel because, first of all, you could travel a lot more smoothly. You were on iron rails. You could go faster than a horse could run for the first time in history. Again, it had its bad points too. You had a lot of soot and smoke and embers, that sort of thing. It wasn't like it is today, but it was a great stride forward.
This carried right through until the Civil War. Then we began to see the advent of the horse-drawn car.
Right. You had what was called the horse railroad or the street railway powered by horses, in which you had a barge or an omnibus-sized vehicle that instead of having wagon wheels had iron wheels with a flange which would fit onto conventional railroad-type iron rail, which was laid in the dirt roadway, and the horse would pull this horse car, and it would hold probably 20, 30 people, maybe more, and was smoother than riding on an omnibus with wooden wheels on a dirt road over the washboard ruts and stuff in the mud.
Right.
It was much smoother.
And it really was, like you say, an extension of the rail system.
Right.
It would take you places that the railroad would not actually be able to get to.
Right. It would go down, you know, all the streets in town or whatever. Sure.
Well, then we come up to the 1890 period, and electricity becomes popular. What happens then?
Several people were working almost at the same time trying to invent some way to power a horse car type vehicle with electric motors, and a gentleman by the name of Frank Sprague was the one who actually came out on top, and he devised a method of putting electric motors down next to the axles on a horse type car conveyance, and through gears driving the axles. And the electric power came in through a pole on the roof, which extended up and made contact with a wire overhead. And that's what actually produced the electric streetcar.
Yeah. And these were really popular right through the turn of the century and well into the present 20th century.
Right, right, yeah. Absolutely.
But then, of course, as the century turned, the automobile came into existence. And what did this do, Rich, to our system?
At first, you know, it really didn't do too much to the streetcar system because the streetcars were a lot faster and a lot smoother than your early automobiles, say from 1900 up through 1912 or so. Cars were really pretty primitive, and the roads were atrocious. And so street railways and interurban railways were luxurious compared to that. But then after, well, say from the time of World War I, say the 1914-18 period, mass production of automobiles began to gain momentum with the Model T Ford, and more people were able to actually buy one of these cars and be able to go out in the garage and turn the crank, and they were off and go anywhere they want, anytime they wanted to, without having to stop and wait for a streetcar.
Right. We have a picture here that we're going to show of the one of the first taxis in Beverly. Down at Beverly Depot, operated by the Desmond family, that we think is the very first taxi service here in Beverly.
Right.
And so we have then the automobile really taking over and becoming, from that of course comes the bus system that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Right. The buses were the natural offshoot of the streetcar because they could go where the streetcars couldn't go. And they didn't have to maintain a system of wires and tracks and all the rest of it. Now,
about how long did the trolley system last, Rich, in this area?
The last trolleys around here were generally 1937. Some of the cars ran on private rights-of-way, for instance, out to Stoneham until the early 1940s. But for the most part, the 1930s around here was the end of street railway service.
Yeah. And along in the 30s, the bus system kind of coexisted along with the trolley system, kind of easing it out of the picture.
That's right. That's right. Certain lines would be given up. For instance, the line from downtown Beverly up to North Beverly and Hamilton and Wenham was done away with in the late 20s, and buses were put on that run. But you still had streetcars coming into downtown Beverly and making the loop around Rantoul and back down Cabot Street again until 1937.
Yeah. Of course, in Boston, we can still see vestiges of a trolley system.
That's right.
Still used today to a degree.
Yep.
And that certainly was an era rich with just wonderful, imaginative experiences. Was it not?
It was.
Riding on the trolley?
It was. You know, obviously you don't and I don't remember riding them around here, but you know, I certainly remember riding them in Boston and in that area over the years. Yeah. And the cars, even though they're more modern types of trolleys than were used here, you know, you certainly get the feeling for what that was like.
Yeah. Yeah, as a boy I remember seeing the tracks, which were still in ground, above ground.
That's right.
Various places in Beverly, Salem area, and I always kind of wondered what it would have been like to have been just a little older to have ridden on them.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, of course, after the we might as well mention the invention of the airplane, because that would be actually the last of the inventive ways in which to move around.
Right.
Really.
Right. And that developed really from World War I. After the war was over, then you had the pilots coming back from the First World War and taking up barnstorming and bringing general aviation to the public. And of course the public was thrilled by all this, but they were also terrified of it.
Sure.
And to actually coax people into the air was a job in itself.
Sure. Well, we're going to back up and we're going to start tonight and talk about the bus system, transportation system as it existed in the greater Beverly area. And we have pictures to show, some of which come from Beverly and others that are taking in the surrounding communities. But the vehicles would have all gone through Beverly.
That's right. That's right. They're sort of generic, and they were everywhere.
Right. Okay, well, let's get right to it, Rich, and start off here with our first photograph. And we're looking at a scene directly in front of the First Baptist Church here in Beverly, down on Abbott Street, dated August 13.
Yeah, this was way back, again, just before the advent of World War I, which was 1914. And here we have what was basically a jitney type of vehicle, sort of a Model T sort of chassis with looks like a homemade body of some kind built on it that looks like it would hold probably maybe a dozen or 14 people. And this probably was something that ran between two sections of town where there was no streetcar service.
Yeah.
And that's how something like that would be initiated.
Interesting to note here the information that we have with the picture. This was a private enterprise deal to start with, and apparently they lost money, gave up the venture, and the Board of Trade, which was the predecessor to the Chamber of Commerce, I would assume here in Beverly, took this idea over and got the bus system going from Beverly to Beverly Farms, which is the beginning of it all, I believe.
That's right, and it's interesting that most of these transportation companies started out as private enterprise, and over the years most of them ended up going in the red and having to be subsidized by tax money.
Right.
Either that or they weren't run anymore.
Right, and here we see on the screen a picture, not in too good a condition, but nonetheless a picture of the Hemian bus line, and I believe the buses are parked right outside the YMCA downtown Beverly. And
right.
This was the company that went down to Beverly Farms.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
Now we look quickly at a 1923 Ford Jitney, Rich. This was more or less the same kind of vehicle that we've just seen.
That's right.
And we move right along now down to Beverly Farms, and here we are going to deal with the Peerless Motor Corporation, Rich.
Yeah, Peerless is an old name in motor vehicles from the early days of the century. And this picture shows a bus or a jitney, if you will, at the Beverly Farms Railroad Station. And the picture was taken on April 8th, 1913, and this was a test run for the proposed Beverly to Beverly Farms route. Now, if you remember from our earlier streetcar program, we mentioned that the streetcars only ran as far as Beverly Cove, because if they had gone down to Beverly Farms, they would have, horror of horrors, brought all the riffraff from Revere, Chelsea, and Boston down to the gentle neighborhood of Beverly Farms, and the people certainly didn't want that. But then they found out they'd outfoxed themselves because they had no way to get down to Beverly. So they started this little jitney line, and here we have one of these Peerless Motor Corporation buses at the station, and on a load of adventurous travelers here, ready for a run down to downtown Beverly.
I bet they were having a great time as this picture was taken. It would be kind of drafty, I would say.
I would think so, and they probably had some kind of curtains you could roll down if it got to be rainy or whatever, but still a pretty windy conveyance.
What about those running boards, Rich?
Yeah, sort of like what they had on open trolley cars, except that these obviously are much further apart and a lot steeper. And we were mentioning before the show that some of these ladies probably would need a boost up here to get into these seats, that steep running board conveyance they have on the side here.
I would say so. And if you happen to fall out the side there as it went around the corner, you were out of luck too.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Okay, the same bus, perhaps. We're looking at the rear end of it here.
Yeah, I think probably it is.
Same day, probably.
Yeah, I
photograph
think so.
taken. And Can you, well, we see the rear of the bus, Rich. Was this meant to be an observation deck or what?
No, I think it was just an open tailgate sort of effect. I mean, it's really nothing more than a truck body with sort of crosswise benches like you would have had in an open streetcar. Jerry rigged into this thing.
Yep.
And as you say, the center of gravity is really high, much higher than a bus would be later on when they finally discovered what a bus was supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Again,
Well,
this is at the railroad station at Beverly Farms.
1913.
April 8th.
We have here a picture of Mr. Mike Michaud, the founder, I would say, of the Michaud bus lines over in Salem. And he's standing in front of a jitney bus dated 1917, Rich. And there's a story here behind how the Michaud Bus Company came to be. Would you kind of tell us about that?
Well, according to this clipping that we've got the picture from, it says that about the time of the Salem fire, which was in 1914, Castle Hill was growing rapidly as hundreds of Canadians crossed the border and settled in that section of Salem. With no public transportation available, Mike Michaud stepped in to fill the need. He is shown with his first jitney, circa 1917, which held nearly a dozen